Ferguson, Staten Island. Much of the nation's attention is currently focused on how police departments interact with their communities, and particularly with residents of color. In response to recent events, this is an Arlington Public News special event. Global to Local, Race Matters. Hello, I'm James Milan. Welcome to Race Matters, the first in a series of public affairs discussions that we're calling Global to Local. This one, of course, is inspired by the events in Ferguson, Missouri, and Staten Island, New York City, among others, that have inspired conversations like this around the country. And here in Arlington, we are just as invested as anywhere else in the country in the questions that we'll be talking about today. We have a distinguished panel to discuss these issues, and I want to introduce them first. On the far left of your television screens and for our live audience here, we have Frederick Ryan, who is the Arlington's Chief of Police. Sitting in the middle is Bonnie Bacci-Williamson, who has done many, many things, but for tonight we will say that she is the co-chair of the Diversity Task Group, which is part of Arlington Vision 2020. And on her left, on your right from the audience, it is Professor Peniel Joseph from Tufts University, who is also the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. Thank you all for being here, and I also want to thank our live in-studio audience and you, our viewers, for being here. It's an important moment for us. Just wanted to ask the panelists to introduce yourselves just a little bit. Obviously, I've given a name and a title, but I want to invite each of you to just speak a little bit about your own experience and what brings you here to the panel tonight. So we'll start with you, Chief Ryan.
Thank you. My name is Frederick Ryan. I serve, obviously, as Chief of Police in Arlington, as demonstrated by the polyester uniform that I'm wearing. I've been employed as Arlington's chief for about 16 years. I was born and raised in Arlington, a graduate of Arlington High School. And I would just add, James, that, in addition to Ferguson and Staten Island, there was some violence in the Bronx where a Hispanic officer and a Asian officer were murdered as a result of the ongoings that we're here to talk about. And I want to thank ACMi for keeping the conversation going. I know we've had some meetings with the Human Rights Commission and the Diversity Task Force following the events of Ferguson and elsewhere. And the importance of keeping this conversation going and being in the learning mode is so critically important to the police department and the community. So I want to thank ACMi.
Thank you. Ms. Williamson.
So, I'm the co-chair of the Diversity Task Group in Arlington, and that is a group that in 1993, the town, through town meeting, they established it. And it has many task groups. The Vision 2020, Arlington Vision 2020 has many task groups, and one of them is the Diversity Task Group. It's a partnership between community volunteers and town officials and town leaders. And I just happen to be a Arlington mom who is a volunteer and is the co-chair, and this is a topic that is obviously very dear to my heart. I think for people of color, it is obviously a very real issue for us, and also as and that's sort of my academic background was in race, class, and gender. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I guess I'm the token academic on the panel. My name is Peniel Joseph, and I'm a professor of history at Tufts University, and I run the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy there. And basically, that center is a research-based center that looks at everything from mass incarceration to race and immigration to voting rights. But I'm intensely interested in these issues because of my background. I'm a native New Yorker. I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in 1965. My mom was a trade unionist. She's retired now. She's 76 years old. Part of 1199, which was Dr. King's union, which was Malcolm X's union, which was Stokely Carmichael's union. And I was on my first picket line in New York City at the age of 8. I've been at protests that were anti-police brutality. I've been at protests that were anti-Haitian refugees in Guantanamo Bay. One thing I would actually disagree with Chief Ryan on is that the tragic deaths of those officers in New York City was actually not related to the Black Lives Matters movement. Fox News has proclaimed that it was, but I can tell you as a social scientist here, empirically it wasn't. There was a deranged person who slaughtered those two officers. That was wrong, that was an assassination, that was murdered. And that person on Facebook, somebody who probably suffered from schizophrenia that was undiagnosed, tried to link the murders he was about to do to the protest movements. And journalists have run with that. But the protesters themselves had nothing to do with that violence that went on in New York City. So the thing we have to do when we're talking about not just Ferguson, but a new social movement that has erupted in the United States, this movement has been nonviolent civil disobedience. Historically, all social movements have on the edges of them extremists who try to utilize that social movement to do terrible things against white people, against black people, against women, against poor people. But in the main, this is not a movement that one iota has talked about some kind of violent overthrow or revolution in the United States. It's talked about racial, economic justice that's connected to the American Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and American democracy and what this country is about.
Thanks very much. Before we go into the next section, I just wanted to outline for our viewing audience how we imagine this discussion will proceed. I have a series of questions that I'm going to be posing to each of our panelists, and I'll direct each one of those questions to one of the panelists. He or she will respond, but then we invite the other panelists, if they have something to say, by all means, to turn it into the conversation that we want to have. When we're done with that series of questions, then we're going to open it to our studio audience as well for all who wish to, who have questions to ask of the panelists. And we have no specific end time to these proceedings. We will go as long as there is interest and energy among the audience and the panelists. So to begin with, I'm going to direct the first question to you, Ms. Williamson, and say that I know that you both helped organize and spoke at the Black Lives Matter vigil that was held here in Arlington Center in mid-December. Several hundred people attended that event, and that connected Arlington to communities in Ferguson, in New York City, and beyond. I wonder, what do you think accounts for the notable public response here in Arlington, and given that for many events, these events do seem far away?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one of the things is that, you know, what we call, like in racial identity development theory, is known as encounter. It's a phase that prior to encounter, which is known as pre-encounter phase, people, whether they're whites or people of color, will often go about their lives, you know, and feel, especially middle-class people of color, and feel that, you know what, this seems like a fine society, everything's okay, life is going on, we're busy with our ballet lessons, kids' ballet lessons and violin lessons, and things are going on. And suddenly something happens, and that is the moment of encounter. Whether that in a person of color might be suddenly facing an incident where somebody is explicitly racist, or whether for a white population something like this happens, where, you know, the frequency of the deaths, it's not like, these are not the first time that young black men have been shot. You know, if you look at New York City, I mean, you know, for the last 20 years, I mean, how many, you know, there's Kiko Garcia and Nicholas Hayward, who's 14, who we haven't even heard of, you know, but when Tamari Rice gets killed, then we've heard of it, because now all these have happened in close proximity, and the movements that have happened. The stirring in Ferguson, the stirring in Staten Island, and suddenly people have woken up and said, this is enough. You know, we need to do something. And I think for the white for the white population, it's suddenly a moment of waking up, and it's suddenly realizing encounter is the moment when you suddenly say, you know what? There's a whole group of people whose lives are not the same as ours. They live by different rules. They are made to live by different rules. They're subjected to different rules and different treatment. And that is encounter. And so that is where sort of the social change starts happening, because people suddenly feel we need to voice something. And I think when this happened, you know, there are families of color in Arlington, and the families of color definitely feel that, well, you know, we're just going to sort of go about our lives, you know, because we don't want to cause too much trouble, you know. And, but I think a lot of people started saying, what are we supposed to do about this? This is wrong. And one of the things I'm just going to say quickly is that, a lot of families were there. And that was what was very touching for me personally.
At the vigil, you mean?
Yes, at the vigil. There were a lot of young children. And I think that was really important because talking to many of the parents, and these are predominantly white parents, and they said that this was the first time that their children had been at something like this. And the first time that they had actually had to explain to them things like racial profiling. Because their children knew about slavery, but that had ended. So the fact that this is an endemic to the institutions in our country is something that they suddenly had to, that conversation started. Unfortunately, it took deaths, of course, for this conversation to move into,
Right.
living rooms. But
I just wanted to say that we do invite you guys, when I ask a question, though I'm asking it and you're being very responsive, and I appreciate that, feel free to address the audience.
Yeah, I'd like to amplify on those comments. I think that in terms of Ferguson and Eric Garner, I think one of the things that we've seen is this, and I'm a historian, so I'm going to place this in historical context, especially the what I call the heroic period of the civil rights movement, which was May 17th, 1954 to August 6, 1965. And that's the modern civil rights movement. There's a long civil rights movement. Massachusetts is a part of it. We can go back to abolitionism. But in a modern sense, and certainly the Second World War, the Greatest Generation is part of that movement too, Great Depression era. But when we think about 54 to 65, we're thinking about the Brown Supreme Court desegregation decision all the way to the Voting Rights Act. Obviously, the film Selma is out. I just saw that a couple of nights ago and wrote something for Newsweek about that as well. What we see with the civil rights movement between 54 and 65, and some of the events that take place, Emmett Till's assassination in the summer of 55, the Montgomery bus boycott, 381-day bus boycott, 55 to 56, with Rosa Parks, E.D. Nixon, a 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr., Little Rock Central High School in 1957, the sit-in movement, February 1st, 1960, at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, that's now a civil rights museum that starts a movement for nonviolent civil disobedience, but really direct action. The Freedom Rides with Congressman John Lewis, who was then chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. The movement in Albany to desegregate Albany, Georgia. And also James Meredith becoming the first black student to enroll at Ole Miss. And there's 3 days of rioting at Ole Miss, and several people die in 1962. In 1963, though, that's really one of the high points of that heroic period. And King is in Birmingham with a local movement, Fred Shuttlesworth, to try to desegregate that city. They've got Bull Connor, who's the city commissioner. People say police commissioner, but he's really the city commissioner. And he's unleashing German shepherds and fire hoses on innocent people. John F. Kennedy is going to say that those scenes make him sick. Right? So it's really only in 63 that we start to have that national conversation. Because even in 61, with the Freedom Rides, Bobby Kennedy is calling people and saying, get those young people out of there, but he doesn't want it to mess up the Kennedy administration and his brother's legacy. It's only by 63, with George Wallace threatening a stand at the schoolhouse door in Alabama. These are all things that are anti-democratic, that stand for absolutely the exact opposite of what this country is for. It's only by 63, right, that people finally have the come to Jesus moment. John F. Kennedy, really in his finest moment, does a live televised address on June 11th, 1963, to the nation, and calls civil rights a moral issue, right? A few hours after he speaks, Medgar Evers, the NAACP field secretary, is shot right outside of his door, in front of his wife and kids. The March on Washington is August 28th, 1963. And remember, one of the first lines of the March on Washington is Dr. King saying, now is the time to make real the promise of democracy, right? So this is about an issue of small d democracy. But the March on Washington is the closest most Americans go to ever attending a mass civil rights meeting. 250,000 people attend, but millions more watching on television, right? So, but even then, after the March on Washington, 3 weeks later, September 15th, 1963, 4 black girls are assassinated by a racial terrorist who plants a bomb at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. A few weeks later, a couple of months later, November 22nd, JFK is assassinated, right? And in 64, you've got the Civil Rights Act and Freedom Summer. In 65, you've got Selma and the Voting Rights Act. The interesting thing for us about Ferguson, right? Even though Miami had an urban uprising in 1982, Los Angeles in 92, Cincinnati in 2001, and of course, there's over 350 civil disturbances in over 250 American cities between 1963 and 1969, right? What Ferguson did, and 8 days later, the Eric Garner decision, what the people it awoke were young white millennials. People of color and veteran activists were in the streets right after Ferguson. 170 cities erupted after Ferguson. Last year, we saw the most empirical demonstrations in the United States since 1970, 44 years. And 1970 is the year of Kent State and Jackson State, and the year there are campus strikes all over the country. And I know this as a historian. I wasn't born in 1970, all right? I know this as a historian. So what's interesting about Ferguson and what's happened in Garner and the Black Lives Movement, we are witnesses to history. My students at Tufts have been active, they've been organizing, but it's not just at Tufts. Washington, D.C., it's not just D.C., Miami. People have nonviolently shut down highways, they've shut down major railroad and transportation centers because they are demanding a vision of social and economic and racial justice that is very much echoing the heroic period of the civil rights movement. So that's what we're seeing. And I agree with the comments about racial encounter, but we're seeing young people and middle-aged people and older people in their own way saying that there's something wrong when our democratic institutions don't function democratically, right? When they don't function the way they're supposed to. And what they're trying to do, and again, this is getting back to what both Kennedy and King said, that civil rights, these were moral issues, not just political issues. Yes, they are policy issues. Yes, they are legal issues, but they are moral issues. And if we can't have the courage of our convictions to articulate that and stand up for that, right? We are no longer the country we are always claiming to be.
Yeah. I was going to ask you to provide some historical context.
Check that off your list.
I don't think I have to.
Interesting, also.
Yeah. Chief Ryan, some people have voiced concerns along the lines of, could this happen here, and how can we feel confident that it won't? Since you are most familiar with the training that Arlington Police Department officers receive, I'm wondering if you can speak to those concerns.
Certainly. I mean, the short answer is, could it happen? Absolutely. It can happen anywhere. And in fact, as a young police officer in the early 1980s, mid-1980s, I was trained by the United States Department of Justice how to profile. I mean, it was a policy of the United States Department of Justice. So for us to ever take the position that racial profiling doesn't happen is absurd. So now we have a generation of police officers we have to untrain and hopefully enlighten and get smarter about having them understand their biases and having them in a safe place where they can talk about their experiences and their background and what biases they may have, and not fear being labeled a racist or some bad person, and then so that they understand the blink response and that they don't bring their biases to work when they decide to engage in an enforcement action or an arrest or any other police action. In Arlington, we have a robust bias-based policing initiative. Is it flawless? Absolutely not. But we track data of all the stops made by police officers. We were talking earlier before the forum. We also track when officers search a detainee, obviously a more invasive type of stop. And then we analyze that data regularly and report out to the Human Rights Commission on our findings. And if officers start to come up looking as though they need training around bias-based policing, we get them that training. I myself have trained under a nationally known social scientist. Her name's Lori Fidel out of the University of Florida on bias-based policing. I studied under her for a week out in Nevada, and I was able to bring back what I learned from Lori and implemented here in Arlington. But the short answer is, can it happen? Yes. And the demonstrations that were just described, when done in a nonviolent way, absolutely supportive of it. But to what end? When are we going to begin to have a conversation about macro level change in the United States and around the social, educational inequities, the lack of economic opportunity for some populations, and start to address the macro level issues rather than blaming and lashing out at police. And so I'm eager for these conversations and for meaningful change to occur from these demonstrations.
Thanks very much. Professor Joseph, I'm wondering whether and how much we might consider the incidents we're talking about, the killing of Michael Brown and of Eric Garner, how much we might consider those as tragic examples of a criminal justice system that continues to be affected at all levels by unconscious or unacknowledged ideas and assumptions about race. And I think this is partly what the chief was just talking about, because I'm talking about implicit bias as opposed to out-and-out racism. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, no, I agree with Chief Ryan in terms of the DOJ, even in the 1980s, because part of this whole idea of a carceral state or mass incarceration, it's really based and predicated on the criminalization of black bodies, right? And this goes back to antebellum America. So in a way, the whole system of law enforcement has served as the new slave catcher. And we're going back to, this year's the 150th of emancipation and the end of the Civil War. And right after the end of the Civil War, there's a brief period of Reconstruction, but there's also going to be the institutionalization of different regimes of racial and economic segregation that are sometimes euphemistically referred to as Jim Crow. Michelle Alexander, of course, the law professor, has the best-selling The New Jim Crow, but there's others too. There's others who've done important work on mass incarceration. One of the first things that happened to black men in the aftermath of slavery, because black men received the franchise with the 15th Amendment, not women. Women couldn't vote till 1920. And there were all these different poll taxes and laws and different things set up to curtail the African-American male vote. But one of the biggest was something called a convict lease system, right? And Doug Blackman has a Pulitzer Prize-winning book that looks, at the aftermath of the system of slavery and how there's a new kind of slavery that gets institutionalized where basically black men were targeted under vagrancy laws to be arrested and convicted as felons. And what local municipalities did was lease those felons out to private companies for a fee, right? And this was legal for decades and decades. And in a lot of ways, the treatment of those men was worse than they received under slavery. Because under slavery, by the time we're talking about 1850, for example, the price of an enslaved black male would be around $30,000 in our money. So it's in current. So it was a big deal this species of property that wasn't. It doesn't mean that it was treated well, but that there was an incentive to not have something that you purchase for $30,000 somehow expire. In the aftermath of slavery, that incentive goes away. So when we flash forward to the 20th century and the criminalization of these black bodies, what we've seen in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, aftermath of these social justice movements, was even before Ronald Reagan, a war on drugs, but a war on black bodies. So the number of African Americans who are in jail now dwarfs that who were in jail in 1964, 65. So when we think about racial progress. And the interesting part is that the laws that allowed this to happen, the language of them are race neutral, right? These anti-crime acts of the 1980s. And also the DOJ, its criminal justice grants. Its criminal justice grants at the state and local level. And the Brennan Center at NYU has offered alternatives with success-oriented funding. What it does, it incentivizes states and local municipalities to arrest in mass certain populations, right? It incentivizes how many arrests do you have, how many big cases. It's not about rehabilitation, and it's certainly not about ending recidivism, meaning the turnstile of people going in and out of prison. So when we think about this has, I agree with Chief Ryan in this sense, that part of our outrage against the police is not capacious enough, because the police are civil servants. The police are weapons or manifestations of the larger society, including our local politicians, our local business community, but also just us as Americans, right? So the reason why people gravitate towards the police are actually a manifestation. They're there to protect us. They're there to provide safety and security. But over the last 30 years, what criminal justice systems have done at the federal, state, and local level in the United States is really criminalize black bodies en masse. The war on drugs became a war on specifically poor black families in segregated communities, sometimes Latino families. And there's even been a spike in the incarceration rates of white Americans as well, but it's not at the disproportionate rate as African Americans. So I think in closing, what I'd say is the saddest part of this issue of mass incarceration is that we live in a country where you can have this juxtaposition of an African American president, which was an example of great progress, presiding over the world's biggest prison population, which has a massive disproportionate number of African Americans who are in that prison population. And the interesting part about this is that initially, people weren't economically incentivized to put all these people in prison, yet now they are. Now there's a private, not only prison industry, there's a private parole industry, there's a private probation industry, right? Where private prisons are telling states, we can do this for less. They're just like sort of charter schools, right? They're saying, we can do this for less money. You're spending $4,000 a year on inmates. What if we told you we could do it for $3,000? What they're not telling you is that they have a huge turnover among their prison guards because they don't have the same benefits. What they're not telling you is that these private prisons are cutting short on nutrition, on any kind of education, any kind of way to rehabilitate these prisoners. So state prison, I'll tell everybody here, is actually better than private prison, right? Unless we're talking about the federal level and the so-called country clubs, right? So the interesting part is that we are now incentivized in the United States to have 2.4 million people in prison at any given time. And that is a tragedy. That's a national tragedy. And the biggest tragedy is that if you are young and African American, you are disproportionately, unless you are in a very, very high income bracket, you are disproportionately gonna be more likely to be criminalized while you're in school, including 5 and 6 and 7-year-old girls and boys being arrested because they're black. Their white counterparts get disciplined in a different way. The discipline is about rehabilitation and not punishment, right? So this is not just about individual bias. This is about the way our institutions are denigrating and demonizing generations of African Americans, right? So it's no wonder that by the time you see Michael Brown in the streets of Ferguson, or if you see Eric Garner in the streets of Staten Island, it's no wonder that you see him as a problem that needs to be curtailed and penned up. Not somebody who you can reason with, not somebody who could be your son or could be your brother, because a lot of this is empathy. When we meet people and we can empathize with them, the last thing we're thinking about is physically harming them or killing them or robbing them of their life, right? The people we think that about are our enemies. And Dr. King used to always talk about the reason he was nonviolent. One of them was that he refused to engage in enemy politics, right? Because if everybody or anyone was the enemy, there was never going to be a peaceful solution and a vision toward what King called a beloved community.
So I just want to go back a little bit to what Peniel was saying. And one of the things is, he mentioned about the suspension rates and the arrest rates for school children. And that basically black children, a black student is 3 times more likely to be suspended from school. And this is at all levels. And once you get suspended, especially once you're in middle school and high school, 9th grade, etc., your chances of dropping out and getting involved with the juvenile justice system just escalates. And so this whole thing of what's known as the school to prison pipeline, that has to be broken at some point. I mean, there was just reading the other day, it's the study on the Rochester City School District in New York, and basically New York State. And so if you look at New York State, I think it was 2012 to 2013, at the rate at which out-of-school suspensions were happening, there was about 565 students being suspended every day. The Rochester School District, there was a 300 years loss of school years. 300 school years were lost. So, and there are incidents, and this is anecdotal, of course, but there are incidents where a third grader, picks up child-proof scissors and is arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. I mean, it's just unbelievable. There is something wrong there. When you can't, and the fact that so many students, 78% of the students who are arrested for nonviolent offenses. When they're suspended, most of the students being suspended, the students of color being suspended, are suspended for things which are known as subjective offenses. What does it mean that a student is disruptive or rude? It's not like they're beating up somebody or they are, coming in with a gun and pointing it.
Meanwhile, there's statutes and policy that inhibit me from being able to further diversify the police department. So we have, an institutional hurdle to a very important goal of mine and the town managers. And so rather than talking to our lawmakers, people are participating in these protests, which we will go to extraordinary measures to ensure their constitutional rights to protest. But shouldn't we be having a conversation with some lawmakers about these issues?
No, absolutely. But I think, Chief Ryan, people have tried to do both. I mean, I just wrote something about Black Lives Matter and public policy and the fact that the Brennan Center's suggestions, the President of the United States right now, and I've been pushing, and there's a writer for the Atlantic Monthly who wrote something similar, could sign an executive order right now that greatly curtails not only the federal prison population, but state and local prisons by transforming the way in which criminal justice grants. Because what Chief Ryan is talking about with the training he received in the 1980s, there's something called Department of Justice grants. And these are grants provided by the federal government to states and local municipalities for a range of training and a range of resources, including the militarization of the police that we saw in Ferguson.
Professor's exactly right.
Okay, so there's this, and so this is really, we're getting into
This was during the highway interdiction, drug interdiction.
Yeah, absolutely,
effort.
especially during the 1980s, and this is ramped up, and it's transformed criminal justice in the United States, right? So instead of having justice grants and DOJ grants that aren't about trying to arrest thousands and thousands of more people, that aren't about trying to lock up more and more people, you could have those DOJ grants that are actually based on success-oriented funding, meaning like how did you do steps to lower your prison population, and also, yes, lower the crime rate, right? Lower the prison population and lower the crime rate. What did you do for people who are leaving prison, right? Who are leaving prison and making sure they're not going to go back? And this huge high recidivism rate, which, by the way, is also recidivism is connected to both Reagan, but also the Clinton omnibus crime bill in the 90s, which did things like prevent anybody who had ever had even misdemeanor offenses, but certainly felony convictions. You could no longer get what we call SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or any kind of social welfare benefits, and you couldn't live in projects in terms of housing that's based on the federal government. No more Section 8. So what the federal government did in 1990s, and everybody, Clinton is praised for doing this, and they're calling him a centrist, and Toni Morrison said he was the first black president, and there's all this mythology about Bill Clinton, right? But unless you're an African-American elite, those policies help destroy black families. Everybody's talking about where are the fathers, where are the fathers, where are the fathers. Many of the fathers are locked up in jail with the help of Democrats and Republicans. So this is a bipartisan issue. It's a bipartisan incarceration and robbing so many young people of any kind of opportunity to make something of themselves in this society. Any kind, forever and ever, right? And then we wonder We wonder when we see segregated communities where there's rife with violence, where they're rife with drug abuse and drug selling, why that happens. And we blame individual pathology instead of saying they're caught in a net, right? Like fish. They're caught in a net that they have no idea what's happening to them. And like you said, I've seen instances where young girls and boys are being led out of public schools in the United States, in America, who are in kindergarten and they're handcuffed. What does that do to their psyche? And would we allow that to happen to white kids in Arlington and Wellesley? That a white 5-year-old, blonde, blue-eyed, is taken out in cuffs for doing some minor petty offense? So we have nothing but punitive punishment for black youngsters, and we think about restorative or rehabilitative discipline for whites, right? And again, I'm all for, even if a kid does something heinously wrong, right? I'm actually all for restorative justice, where we have a mentality in this country of too much punitive punishment, right? We want the death penalty. We want revenge, for God's sake, right? For any kind of offense in this country. And that's not how you change children's lives. You change their lives by giving them a context to achieve something more, not by locking them up and throwing away the key. And then being surprised the one time they might get out of prison, they can't read, they can't write, they have no usable skills in our capitalist economy, and they're violent, and then we're supposed to be surprised at that.
And to put some local context into the professor's comments, couldn't agree with him more. Restorative justice, you may or may not know that Arlington participates in a private nonprofit restorative justice. We divert a lot of our criminal cases to address the harm caused by a criminal offense in a restorative environment. Thank you for saying that. Secondly, to bring it to a local context, so we have a mental health clinician in the police department that co-responds with police officers to help manage criminal situations that have a mental health component to it. We were finding that we were arresting people for criminal offenses, usually relatively minor criminal offenses, because the police officers had no other tool on their tool belt to deal with a case of a person in crisis at 11 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning. So we went out and we worked with the Department of Mental Health, got a grant. We now have a clinician that co-responds with our police officers, and our arrests are going down. Now, in a sophisticated community like Arlington, and we're blessed with a finance committee and a town manager that aren't looking at numbers saying, hey, your arrests are going down, so that obviously means you need fewer cops. No, the arrests are going down by design. And you know, the absence of crime is a good thing. And that doesn't mean we need fewer cops, we need more sophisticated police officers. And we strive to continue to drive those arrest numbers down. And I know you were more on the macro level and national level, but that's what we're doing here locally.
That's
terrific.
great. That's great to hear. Got just a couple more questions in this section. Going to direct the first one back to you, Chief Ryan, and then close with one to you, Ms. Williamson. So, Chief, one of the potential changes that we've heard most about is the use of body cameras by police officers. On the one hand, this could allow for a record to be preserved for all to see, and on the other, concerns have been raised about cost, training, privacy implications for citizens. What is your current thinking about this idea, and are there any steps being taken to implement it here in Arlington?
Yeah, you know, I make the comparison to the dash cams that we see used in many jurisdictions around the country. You don't see it very much in Massachusetts because of Mass General Law, Chapter 150E. And, you know, I get back to where, the lawmakers, Chapter 150E handcuffs me to be able to manage our police department. Everything that I do has to be bargained with a union. I have zero management rights. And so you don't see many dash cams in Massachusetts because of the power of the union. Now that's not a criticism of unions, I'm just stating facts. And so you don't see many dash cams. The overwhelming majority of incidents where police officers were filmed on dash cams helped the officer during the investigation of the incident and demonstrated that they acted responsibly. So is there potentially a value for cameras for police officers? Absolutely. Is it the panacea? Absolutely not. You know, building trust and legitimacy by further diversifying our police departments, which I can't do because of Mass General Law, is absolutely the highest priority. If the community that we police doesn't trust us, we're dead in the water. And so legitimacy and procedural justice are critically important to any program of carrying cameras or satellites filming, well, you know, whatever technology comes down the pike a year from now. If we don't have the trust to begin with, the technology is really a waste of resources as far as I'm concerned. We're going down the road in Arlington on you know, police officers don't disengage well. We're trained very well at engaging people. We spend a lot of time at the Basic Recruit Academy, you know, gun side away, keep your hands in the ready position, make sure you can see who you talk, see where their hands are. And then when you realize that the gentleman in the purple sweater is not the suspect you're looking for, we say, okay, you're free to go. And then we go about our business. Well, we're going, you know, procedural justice is pretty simple. People want to be treated fairly. They want the officer to explain why the officer did what they did. And they want to be given an opportunity to ask the officer a question or maybe make a suggestion. So, and you know, we've done some role-playing on this. We're seeing that officers can, under the scenario that I just described, I'm looking for a white male in a purple sweater for a robbery. I detain this gentleman, find out he's not the person responsible for the crime. Historically, we say, okay, you're free to go. And I go about looking for other people in purple sweaters. We're now, under the procedural justice curriculum, we're going to say, sir, thank you for your time. We've had a report of a robbery. You fit the description. If you see anybody, please call it. Get them in the canoe with us to prevent further crime and victimization versus you're free to go. What kind of a message does that send? You're free to go. That means I was detained. That means I wasn't free for a moment. And so we don't disengage well. We're terrible at it. So I think as a profession, there's a lot of work we can do to improve the interactions, particularly with the minority community, and to, in a more sophisticated way, provide police services. Will cameras be an element of that? Absolutely, in my lifetime they will be, but they won't be the panacea.
Thanks very much.
And I think Eric Garner shows us that they're not the panacea. I mean, I think the Eric Garner case, and it wasn't a body camera. Somebody had filmed that, and he said, I can't breathe 11 times. Street peddler, he's selling cigarettes, loose cigarettes. But obviously, the very fact that NYPD is detaining people selling loose cigarettes is connected, like Chief Ryan said, to it's a larger political context of you know, the New York City Council, of the mayor, like, you know, and again, part of this is connected to the so-called broken windows theory, and that's the theory that the way in which you prevent crime, and in the 1990s, there was certainly massive crime in New York. I grew up in New York City in the 80s and the 90s, and certainly we all know from the 1970s, there was a cinematic response, Dirty Harry, Charles Bronson, Death Wish, and they were killing, for the most part, Black and Latino assailants. You know, that's and it's a very interesting juxtaposition because in the real world there are these massive social movements that were outside. You know, labor and Black and women, but in the movie theater you're just finding Black, thieves and criminals and rapists being killed by these sort of white Avengers, most notably Clint Eastwood. But by the 90s, under both David Dinkins and Rudy Giuliani, the Safe City, Safe Streets program took place in New York City. And the broken windows theory was this theory that, you know, if you can stop small violations, you can snowball and really stop bigger things, you know, like you can, so the broken window is really attracting more crime, right? So you sort of get these people on minor charges, but they could be people who are habitual offenders, felons, different things like that. The problem is, as we've continued that program, we got into the stop and frisk, where we stopped thousands and thousands of young, mostly Black men and Latino men between 18 and 25, 18-30 in New York City. In Boston, it's about 17 to 25 if you look at the ACLU's report, which is the stop and frisk that Boston does. 24% black in the city, 63% of those who were stopped were African American. So you're just stopping. Less than 2% were charged with anything, less than 2%. So it's certainly this massive net, right? So we need another way.
But is that an element of the
policing.
broken windows policing?
Well, I think
stop and
it's escalated into that in terms of stop and frisk has become connected to at least a theory of why. Certainly, New York City has the lowest murder rate
Right.
in 51 years. And I've seen what happened in New York City, but it's really, what I would argue is that the reason why crime went down so much in New York City, it's not necessarily strictly policing. What we saw was a reinvestment in New York City, okay, in terms of economic. What we saw in the 1970s, there's a point where New York City is almost bankrupt in 1975. There's a great, and people can Google this, Daily News from 1975, where Ford to New York City dropped dead because Gerald Ford became president August 9th at 12:01, 1974, after the only man in American history to resign from office resigned, Richard Nixon, right? So this idea that cities went from having federal investment in their budgets at 15% of their budgets to 5% in the mid-70s. So when we think about a place like Detroit, where everybody fled starting in 1967, right? So people talk about $8,000 homes in Detroit now. People started leaving Detroit, white people, in 1967. But guess what? People started to leave New York in the late 1960s as well. So the reason why New York is back is we've seen massive billion-dollar investment, not just in Manhattan, but in downtown Brooklyn. Right? Brooklyn is the new Manhattan, at least when you think about from Fort Greene to the Manhattan Bridge and what's called Dumbo, right? So, yeah.
Sorry.
Now I'm lecturing.
But I got to push back a
Yeah.
little respectfully on, with the professor. Professor Kelling has written and researched the broken windows policing. It's far more, and that was a good summary of it. It's far more than addressing the broken windows and the minor issues in a neighborhood. It's also about partnering with the neighbors in those neighborhoods to find out what's important to the neighbors here, and how can we address quality of life issues?
I believe, yeah, I agree.
And then that has evidence. I mean, the evidence supports it. The crime went down in part due to broken windows theory of policing. Edward Kelling, I think, was the professor that authored the broken windows document. Did that manifest itself into stop and frisk? I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen any research.
I
on
would
that.
say in New York it did.
And I think there's been a lot of controversy about whether that stop and frisk and broken windows were really responsible for the decline in crime. Because even
I think
after
the evidence clear it played a role in it. Was it solely responsible? No.
But because when they've made, in August of 2013, when it became unconstitutional to do stop and frisk in New York City, the crime rates, Commissioner Kelly said, oh yeah, the crime rates are going to go up immediately. And they haven't, because the decline happened, the highest peak of stops was in January of 2012. Okay, and after that it's gone down, and it hasn't gone up. So
This is stops.
Right, stops. And even before stop and frisk was instituted, crime was already going down.
Right.
So it's a much more complex issue than just, because incarceration, stop and frisk, and consent searches are not necessarily reducing, because what they're doing is taking away the legitimacy of the police force.
Right, but having police officers out, I mean, we have an officer that goes out and deals with graffiti on the bikeway, because we know that graffiti is clearly lends itself to an environment where other children might come along and vandalize. And so addressing those without stopping and detaining anybody, but addressing environmental issues.
Right, it sounds like what you're talking about is what I think of as community policing, which in
Exactly.
general seems like a very, very positive thing that
Yeah.
has had clearly
And
positive
allow the
repercussions
neighborhood
at
to
different
decide
places.
how they want to be policed. And
I'm sorry, I am going to move on to the last question so that we also have time for the audience to get involved. And this is for you, Ms. Williamson. As a resident of Arlington and the co-chair of the Diversity Task Group, as we mentioned, that task group, as part of Arlington Vision 2020, is focused not only on where we are, but where we're going. So I'm, as a community, so I'm wondering, what are you most concerned about as Arlington's kind of demographic mix continues to evolve. And what are you most excited about?
So I think this is important because I think you sort of put it right there. You use the word demographic. And diversity for people who really are committed to it is more than just demographics. It's a process. We have a substantive agenda there, of changing existing arrangements of power. So it's not multiculturalism. It's not food, fabric, and fiesta. There is a little more to that than that. So I think that's where the big rub is, that people are very happy with celebration.
Yeah.
And the multicultural aspect of it, we went to this restaurant and, look at the beautiful fabrics and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to changing existing arrangements of power, it becomes, wow, that sounds kind of radical and revolutionary. So what does it say about our society that is supposed to be democratic if equity and doing away with issues of injustice and exclusion are considered to be revolutionary and radical? What does it say about our society? And I think the way I look at Arlington, I've been living here for 10 years, and it's a very nice community. But the way I look at it is it's sort of like we are like a big house where families of color or people of color and internationals and white families, we are like roommates. We live polite, we rub shoulders in the kitchen, and we're polite with each other, and we're civil, and we have good relationships, There's not like a big hate crime or anything happening, every second day or anything like that. But there is not really an exchange. And the whole thing about contact theory, Allport's contact theory, is equal status exchange. And that is essential. There has to be equal status exchange, because when there is equal status exchange, there is tremendous change in the cognitive complexity of majority group members. And that is why it's so important to have minority group members. They say, people will often say, they have the token black person on the committee. But you know what? The token black person suffers from tremendous minority stressors. The METCO program, for example, in the school, the small number of students, I'm sure they suffer from minority stresses, which is like they have to stand up for their community. They have to, they have to be perfect. They get into trouble. It's not just a kid acting up. It's a black kid acting up. There's a difference there. So the issue becomes that, there are minority status stresses, but at the same time, having somebody, a person of color on a committee, makes huge differences. Because when you look at jury pools, jury pools are, as we know, randomized. But when you look, if it is a all-white jury, the chance of them convicting a black defendant is 16 percentage points higher. If there is one black juror, the rates of conviction are more or less the same. So it does make a difference. And I think that's what we want to see in Arlington, is more and more, I think, so the three institutions of social mobility, right? Education, employment, and housing. Those are the three we want to focus on. And first is the school systems. We need tremendous cultural competency training at every level. Like I'm still learning how the town works. And so I do have a lot of questions, which I don't have the answers for because I haven't yet had time to look into. But, are town officials, do they have cultural competency training? Does the Human Rights Commission have a person of color on it? Especially positions that are appointed. Is there an effort made to diversify those committees? These are extremely important. What is the cultural competency training of the staff and the faculty? It amazes me when my third graders, I have 3 children in the school system. My youngest is again in 3rd grade, the last person to be in 3rd grade. And they have this, they do a biography project. And they can choose whoever they want. And the students, and then they read about that person and they do a presentation, et cetera, et cetera. And it's wonderful. And the students learn about, Alexander Graham Bell, somebody chooses Florence Nightingale, all these are wonderful. And my daughter chose Harriet Tubman, my son chose Frederick Douglass, and I'm still waiting to see who my third will choose. But those are the little changes that a teacher can easily make. If the teacher just says, choose someone from a different race or a different culture than your own, immediately you will have a flood of role models in there. If you're doing a math word problem, instead of Robert giving Jane, Robert has 5 apples and gives Jane 2. If it's Jelani giving Aliyah, immediately those names become normal. and that is essential, this whole thing of the fact that people of color are part of this community, they're part of this house.
Thank you very much. And that does wrap up this portion of tonight's discussion. We're going to move to questions from the audience now. So thank you all for your patience. Anybody who would like to ask a question, you just need to raise your hand. And we're going to get you a microphone.
This question is for the entire panel. Chief Ryan had mentioned that his hands are tied due to Massachusetts policies in regard to diversifying the police force. And certainly, Ms. Williamson and the professor were very eloquent in breaking down the criminalization of African Americans, young African Americans and Latinos. Well, certainly we know if you have any type of a prison record, you can't become a police officer. So if the chief is saying that Massachusetts policies ties his hands, and we know what you obviously broke down about criminalization of African Americans and Latinos, is diversifying the police force in this state, is it a pipe dream then? How is that possible that this can happen?
Well, I mean, and I should point out, I'm learning as I listen to two distinguished professors. I'm enjoying this. We got to get creative and not use, I could sit back and say, hey, I can't diversify. What we've done is, okay, we've looked at lateral entry hiring of police officers, and that means we can that's one tool I can use and put out a job ad and try to encourage minority and women officers from other departments to come to us, and we've had some level of success with that. I've gone out to community colleges. I've been to Bunker Hill, I've been to Middlesex in both Bedford and Lowell, where I know Arlington students study criminal justice, and many of them are from the minority community, and encourage them to take the police exam and to pursue a rewarding career in law enforcement. I was at, I think I was at the Bedford campus, and a young student came up and introduced himself afterwards. He was a black kid, and he said he was from Arlington. I shook his hand, nice to meet you. And why I asked him this, I don't know, but I said, where do you live? Where in town do you live? And I could see he was a little ashamed to tell me. He said, well, I live in the projects. And I said, well, I grew up there. I grew up on 96 Fremont Street. And I could see his body language change. Like, my police chief grew up in the projects? And so, we're trying to get creative about recruitment and getting more minorities to take the entry-level exam. And when I say state policy inhibits me from diversifying, I should be clear. Applicants take an examination, and they go on to an eligibility list. And by and large, in Arlington, what would you suspect the eligibility looks like? White men. There's also an option to get a minority list called a Part 10 list. But in order for me to get that list, and I've tried, I have to say that I have engaged in discriminatory hiring practices in writing. And so if I say that in writing, they'll say, okay, we'll give you the minority list. Now, do you think I'm going to say that in writing? I say on the phone, the reason we've engaged in discriminatory hiring practices is because of your policy. And so it's this back and forth. And so that's why I'm very happy that ACMi and the Diversity Task Force and others are keeping this conversation going, because I'm hoping it results in meaningful change at the macro level, institutionally and statutorily.
But it is extremely challenged, though. It's extremely challenged.
Yeah, and I'm one who thinks, I think with the problems that we've had in just nationally with criminal justice, I think diversifying police and body cameras, I think they're important, but I think the larger issue is how do we end institutionally the criminalization and also the incentives to criminalize black bodies, because that's what's going on. So if you're African American and you're at Tufts like me, or have friends and colleagues at Harvard, you're not in that negative pipeline. So you're on your own, you're on this different track, and you may have a bad experience with the criminal justice system, but it's going to be through happenstance. You know what I mean? It's going to be through a kind of profiling. You know, so you'll always hear the story of a mass judge who got profiled, or you know, Skip Gates, or you know what I mean. Like it's going to be an oddity because for the most part, you're just not going to be involved, connected to law enforcement. You're not hanging out on a street corner. You're not connected to drugs or any kind of sort of aberrant behavior, right?
You're not committing crimes.
You're not committing crime. So the interesting thing, though, is that the criminalization of black bodies means that even when they're not committing crimes, they are more likely, and this gets with drug interdiction, because Michelle Alexander and others have shown how whites and blacks have the same level of drug use, right? But drug interdiction is predicated on profiling, whether you're profiling white, black, young, old, whatever you're doing, you're profiling. So, because I can take everybody to, I remember growing up in New York City, Washington Square Park, across the street from NYU. Everybody was smoking marijuana and selling marijuana. The police were picking and choosing who to arrest, but they could do it to anybody. You know what I mean? It wasn't just African Americans who were always getting arrested for it. There was a bunch of white NYU kids who were selling, you know, whatever, right? Most of the time, the police didn't choose to target that population. So when you look at, when sometimes people say, well, what's the level of arrest for African Americans versus whites, and who's committing the crimes? When it comes to drugs in particular, so I'm not talking about robbery, but drugs in particular, that's a crime where police, the level of drug abuse in the country is so high that police are only arresting a tiny sampling of the millions of people who engage in regular drug use, right? And so the disproportionate number of black and Latinos, certainly some of it is connected to the fact that in segregated poor communities where people are taking drugs, there's going to be violence. There's going to be violence. So some of it is connected to that, but some of it's also connected to the DOJ and the war on drugs absolutely targeting these communities, right? And from that perspective, more diverse police officers and body cameras is not the solution from that perspective. You see what I'm saying? We need leadership. The reason why I say there should be pressure on the president to sign this executive order is because this executive order transforming the way in which doing a federal review of all Department of Justice criminal justice grants and transforming it from punitive to success-oriented would have a huge impact on African Americans. And we don't need, and Latinos, but also poor whites, we don't need the Congress for this. So part of it, when we think about, hey, the protests and all this stuff, if we can link that to real policy measures, real specific policy measures, right? And a lot of times, this is not necessarily sexy. I mean, when King was in Selma, not only they were pushing for voting rights, and what Lyndon Johnson was trying to do and King was trying to do, they're also trying to draft legislation, and White House advisors are trying to draft legislation. Part of what eventually was crafted included 6 states, included federal registrars, it included Department of Justice oversight, that you couldn't have any kind of willy-nilly voting patterns or voter ID or anything like that, right? So what we know is that you need actual policy transformations if you're going to change social justice in the United States. It's got to be connected to policy. I think so far what we've seen is people definitely, there's a Ferguson Action website where they're talking about ending unemployment. They're talking about all these different things, but you've got to get down into the weeds. And I think that at the state level, if we wanted to diversify more police officers, I don't know if we would need whether it's Charlie Baker who could help do that, or is it the legislature that could do that. And that's something we should look at. But the bigger problem is, why do we live in a democracy where black people are targeted as criminals and are demonized and are arrested and are murdered and physically assaulted? And why do we all allow that to happen? And that's why I've been so proud of the Black Lives Matters and the diversity of the Black Lives Matters protest, because what you have is what's as American as apple pie is civil disobedience, right? Whether it's women's suffrage, whether it's LGBT, Native Americans took over Alcatraz in 1969. They're not telling you that in your history books. You know, at least the ones you're given in whatever public high school you went to, right? They're not going to tell you about LGBT beyond Stonewall. One thing that President Obama said at his second inauguration, he said from Seneca Falls, which is suffrage, to Selma, which is the vote to Stonewall, right, which is LGBT, right? So the protests, which people are so upset about, are the core of our values as Americans, right?
Yep.
We've lost our values when we say you're not supposed to stand up for social justice in this country.
Okay, thank
And
you.
I think I just want to add a little bit to that, is that, you know, for many of us, social justice is what propels us. But even just pragmatically, if we just want to be completely hard-headed about it, you know, I mean, by 2050, the census projections show that the numbers are going to change. You know, whites are going to be still, okay, the largest minority, but they will be in minority. And we do not want this to become Zimbabwe. Do we really want this to become Zimbabwe? You know, I mean, the writing is on the wall, and people are not listening and not seeing it. So that is what's amazing to me. I mean, I feel a little bit like, you know, it's sort of like when we watch a movie about antebellum America, and you look at the plantation family, and you're looking at the wives and daughters, and you're wondering, how can you live and just have these genteel lives and have your tea parties and dinner parties? You know, when you're seeing this kind of injustice happening. And what's happening is that that's where we are. As middle class folks, that's where we are. Because there are communities of color and poor communities that are being decimated. And we are still continuing with our little dinner parties and our intellectual conversations. And, you know, so what are we doing?
Okay. Yes, sir. Just hold on 1 sec and you get the microphone.
Chief Ryan, I'm very concerned about what's happening in New York City right now with the police department, where we seem to have a slowdown strike and a rebellion against the city administration.
Can you hold the microphone a little closer?
The city administration there seems to have a police department that is in rebellion, and it's a well-armed, huge force, where they're not writing tickets, they're not doing their job, they're protecting their own selves. And I'd like your comments on that.
You know, I only know what I've read in the newspaper, and, you know, clearly, though, I mean, I'm wearing a black band around my badge. Clearly, those officers are at high risk. We know about the two that were killed. I don't know if you all know, there's many more that have been threatened. I think they've arrested 20-some people for making serious threats against the lives of New York City police officers. So to expect some, contraction in their proactive policing, I think, is human nature, and you know, they're looking at their own survival, I think, at this point. In terms of similar reactions from police unions historically, they're temporary and driven mainly by emotion and fear. These cops are in fear, and they're emotional about some political debate they're having with political officials. I think if you look around the country where we've seen this happen in other cities, it's always temporary.
So we've seen that before. I wasn't aware of that.
We've seen it in, I mean, if you look at most recently in Boston during the Democratic National Convention, there was a lot of unrest between the mayor and the Boston Police Patrolmen's Union, and some issues going on there. I mean, it's not uncommon for unions to use that as a tool to try to further their agenda. And I'm not suggesting their agenda is illicit or inappropriate. I'm not assigning any value to that. I'm just saying that's a tool that's been used regularly.
Well, some precincts are essentially not writing any tickets. They're not doing their job. They're not parking tickets, speeding tickets. They're nothing. There's no arrests going on. They're essentially just not doing their job.
I don't have the first-hand information to comment on that.
Okay. We're going to move to another question now. Just at the back.
Hi. Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you all for coming here and sharing your perspectives with us. I just wanted to say Blue Lives Matter as well. And it isn't blue on black and black on blue. That's the result of all of the social ills that you were talking about. The police are only there to execute the law that other people make, and it's the result of corporate greed and all of the other levels of problems. And I just wanted to say that I'm from Medford, and Medford goes back to slavery and all of that stuff. And I know all of that stuff, and I was a child in '77 when the high school, had their race riots. So I know I'm not talking from the white liberal perspective. I'm talking from the working class white perspective, and I was in the military, I was in the Army, so I have that perspective to share too. But my comment is that from a white perspective, I'm not afraid of being called a racist. I can engage, I'm around the VA, I'm around people of color all the time, and I'm used to that. But for white liberals to be called a name just because they say they have a bias or something, they're afraid of the rage, the anger, the pent-up anger. When I'm around a black woman and she's going off on me as a veteran, you know, and she's telling me about my white privilege in the Army, at first I took it and I was like, what did I do? You know, but I got past that a long time ago. But white people can't handle the rage, the anger, the feelings, and then to be like, if I'm a professional, the last thing I want to do is even indicate that I might be biased or racist. I am, but I'm going to use all the nice words so that we can avoid that, and I get around it because I don't want to lose my job.
Yeah.
And that I don't have that fear, so I can engage in those kind of talks. But if I had something to lose, it's a whole different thing. So we need to, yes, it's true, because in the 70s, the jokes were flying from anti-Semitic to, you name it, ethnic groups, Polish group, whatever the group was, you know. But we've gotten to a point in our society where those jokes aren't, you know, acceptable. And we've grown enough that we can have an engagement between people. But if we're afraid of being called names, we're not going to engage them. So we need to take it to that next level. We're grown up enough to say, you know, well, that's bias instead of it's racist. That's what you always hear on the news or the, you know, the TV. So that guy's racist because he said something, you know, just a minuscule of a stereotype about black people or whatever the case might be. And so if we got to
I'm
not
sorry, I want to
overemphasize.
thank you for your comments,
thank
but
you.
I didn't know whether, are they leading to a question, or
Well,
were you?
my question is, how do we take it to that next level where we're not afraid of being called a racist, or we're not, you know, where we can engage in a conversation like she's talking about, where we're not so polite, but we're both
but
of
we're
us
more-
are listening.
But we're more honest.
Yeah, and we're honest. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I appreciate the comments, but one thing I'll say is that when you think about, you know, race in America and racism in America, and really one of the things I think the Black Lives Matter movement has done really brilliantly is really resuscitated this movement for black equality, because black equality is always the common denominator for all these different social justice ills. So for a panoramic number of ills, and it's not because black people are so somehow better than other people, it's because they've always been at the cutting edge of democracy because of the history of racial slavery in the United States. So there's a new book, Empire of Cotton, that looks at cotton and capitalism and slavery, right? And there's been some other great new books about slavery and capitalism. The Half Has Never Been Told, Ebony and Ivy, The River of Dark Dreams, all this great scholarship that connects slavery to capitalism. The reason why that's so important is that we are founded as a nation state on a system of racial slavery, and it's something that we still have not come to terms with. We're all still dealing with the legacy. The wealth of American capitalism and global capitalism is born on the backs of enslaved Africans who were human beings and not just this species of property, even though Dred Scott and the Supreme Court said so. So part of it is that I remember when Barack Obama on March 18, 2008, gave his race speech, and it was a speech in Philadelphia that saved his campaign in the aftermath of clips of Jeremiah Wright. It was a very, very brilliant rhetorical speech, but it was a morally flawed speech, because what the speech did was basically say there was a moral equivalence between slavery and white resentment that black people have been so upset since slavery. That's what it said. It said, so on the one hand, there was slavery and all this ill that happened and this violence and brutality that happened during slavery. On the other hand, I could see why white working class people are upset about affirmative action. I can see why they're upset about certain black nationalists who might be reverse racist. I can see why they're upset about the Nation of Islam or Louis Farrakhan. Those aren't morally equivalent. What's happened to African Americans in the United States, there's no moral equivalency. We don't speak with moral clarity. We do when it comes to anti-Semitism, because 6 million Jews, unless you're a Holocaust denier, were slaughtered. That's genocide. We speak very, very morally specific about that. And certainly those who are connected and advocate for Israel's right of not just statehood, but to have peace in the Middle East, always connected to a moral clarity. When it comes to slavery in the United States, and then contemporary racism, why do we have more black men in prison now than who were actually in prison during the antebellum slave period or during 1965, right? These are all morally clear, but politicians cannot be morally clear. I'm not running for anything, nor will I ever, right? I'm just a tenured professor and really a civil rights activist. I can say that the biggest problem that we have in this country, not policy-wise, not just political, morally, is a failure to understand the way in which everything that we've gotten as a democracy is rooted in racial slavery and its aftermath. These are ill-gotten gains morally, not just politically, but morally. If we don't teach, and again, people like, it's not just King, but Rabbi Heschel taught this. We've had good white clergy and Latino clergy who've taught this, right? This is a moral issue. JFK said it in 1963, but when we don't articulate it as such, because it's certainly historical, it's certainly public policy, right? But there is no moral equivalency between black people suffering under racial slavery and a regime of Jim Crow, and right now a new Jim Crow and white resentment. There is no. So when we have millennials who think that anti-white racism is the biggest problem in the United States, that is a sickness that is part of the disease of racism that has always been manifest in our DNA. There was no white backlash in the 1960s. It was a politics and practice of white supremacy that continued since the founding of the nation state, right? So this is not a story with a happy ending unless we make the happy ending. The reason why King's movement is so heroic is because he's saying, even with all this at the March on Washington, we can come to a beloved community if we're honest, and like you said, if we transform the power relations in the country. That's what he's saying. He's saying we can actually move forward, even after all these people were mistreated in this way, not just in the past, but contemporaneously. He was saying that in 63, and 52 years later, what he's saying is still relevant in our own time. That's why Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, that's why all this stuff is popping up. Because we don't have not just the policy foresight, we don't have the moral clarity and the moral courage to talk about what happened then and the way in which that's connected to what's happening to young people all over this country right now, but also white people. Because white people have been disfigured and defamed by what happened in this country, and they continue to be. You lose your soul even at the expense of having a nice Brooks Brothers suit or being elected to a high office or being part of corporate America, because this is not how things are supposed to be.
And just have one thing to add to what he has to say, and that is that, just to take it to a much more mundane level, it's just, with the young people nowadays, it's even scarier because they are living through a time when there was slavery, it was very clear. You could see it. It's very visible. But now it's so much more, people are not even aware. And I think that's the problem, is the lack of information. This is where schools and colleges come in. This is where courses cannot just be electives. They have to be required courses. Because when I talk to, I've done some adjunct teaching at the graduate school level, and when I talk to my students, and these are really nice liberal students, really nice people, and they've never heard of redlining. Yeah. That's amazing. It's like, and then you say, why can't black students, why aren't there more black students in college? Why aren't there more black men in college? The whole factor of getting loans and going to school and getting an education is so much tied to your housing situation, whether you can get mortgages or not, and they've never heard of redlining. So all these things, and when I'm telling them about it, they're looking at me as though, where is she getting this from? Like, if it really happened, we would have heard about it. And that is what I mean.
Yeah.
Yes,
Ferguson,
that is exactly
that's where Ferguson and Black Lives Matter. It's been a great, for everybody here who has kids, especially who are of age where they're understanding this. This has been a great, and I've written about this extensively and talked about it. This has been a great first-class education in terms of many of my students were not born when the Rodney King urban rebellion happened. That was April 29th, 1992. Seeing Ferguson 3 days before Thanksgiving, and then seeing Eric Garner 8 days later. And, they've done die-ins, they've done all these different things. 1,000 of them marched, and it started at Tufts, MIT Bridge, in December 6th of last year. It's been hugely extraordinary. And the young millennials, even if their parents have forgotten and their grandparents, who are the baby boomers, have forgotten, many of them have been very, very active. And again, the brilliant
Professor,
thing...
I'm
Yes.
sorry. I'm sorry. I know somebody is waiting, and we are, in fact, running out of time, amazingly enough.
Question. First of all, Dr. Joseph, congratulations on your book on Kwame Ture.
Oh, thank you.
Now, this is for the panel. What part does fear come into this?
You said fear?
Fear.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
Chief Ryan.
I've got 2 PhDs next to me.
Well, I'll just take the mundane, community person's view. I think fear is on all sides. I think there is fear on the part of, it's the whole spectrum of not only people of color, but also the white majority, because there are people who feel that, oh my goodness, this is like, what is going on? Are we going to be in a bloodbath or a civil war? How is this going to go? Okay, so there's that kind of extreme fear. And then there is the fear of the people who are really, well-meaning, liberal, social justice inclined whites, who are sort of saying what the lady back there was saying, is that, well, we didn't do anything, we are for this cause, but, we are sort of getting, where do we stand? Because we feel the same way as you, we have the right values, we mightn't have gone through the same experience, but where do we stand? So there's that kind of fear, the fear of being in between. And for people like me, my children are biracial, and I just, when I've been taken to be the whole thing, right? I've been taken from being the Latina Latina nanny of my very light-skinned biracial daughter to being, last week, to being a medical doctor because I was Indian, right? So the whole, and since now the top medical doctor in the nation is an Indian, right? So it's the whole range. So, but the point is that, for people like us, it's a question of, where are we going with this? What is going to happen when society changes? Where will my children grow up? Will we really be able to come to that society which is marked by compassion and understanding rather than becoming a reverse racism? So I think that is there, and I think people of color are scared too, because in a town like Arlington, which is predominantly white, you're going to be careful about what you say. I mean,
I'm
if
the
I'm
fly in
meeting,
the buttermilk, and I live in Somerville.
Yeah, I'm in Somerville too. I think fear is connected to segregation. I think part of the problem with contemporary American society is that we're living under a regime of Jim Crow. And this Jim Crow it doesn't have white and colored signs, it just has white and colored outcomes, right? So the disparities, the inequalities are in all the outcomes. We all know it as citizens. All of us who are intelligent and literate know it. And even those of us who are not intelligent and not literate, they feel it, right? And I think the rage comes when you don't have a way of articulating and turning your moral passion into a movement. Because the three things that all social justice movements have historically, globally, are one, they are morally impassioned, two, they're creatively disruptive, but three, they're policy specific because they want things to change, right? So the problem for all of us, when you talk about fear, is the politics and practices of segregation. We live right now, 2015, blacks and whites are still more likely to be born, to live, to work, and die apart rather than together, right? The lowest rates of interracial marriage are between black and white, not white and Indian or white and Asian, the whole continent of Asia, right? When we think about housing, and sociologists do the work for us, by the time a neighborhood has 6-7% African Americans, whites who can move out do move out. When we look at gentrification and what's happening in places like Brooklyn and places like Dudley Square, whites are coming in, but they move into neighborhoods that are 30% more or more white. So they're replicating these patterns. We live in a deeply segregated, perversely segregated society. And you talked about fear, but the other part of this is the lure, right? And the eroticization of blackness, whether it's hip hop culture, whether it's rap music, whether it's simply black bodies, both male, female, straight, gay, and everything in between, where there's an aspect of black culture that people, whether it was during slavery or the Harlem Renaissance, where these cultural tourists, where people go on safari into black communities or black culture, right? And they come back with all the wealth, whether you're talking about Iggy Azalea, whether you're talking about anything that's happening. So it's a very interesting dynamic and dialectic, but we have to name it and claim it. I think the most important part of the civil rights movement was its ability to speak truth to power. We've lost that in 2015. Our racial conversation is not as sophisticated as it was 50 years ago.
And if I could just
Yep.
very quickly
Absolutely.
dumb it down a little. The more I think about that question, it's a great question. And if we've got a community in fear of its police, and police in fear to police its community, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And we're going this concept of depolicing. We've come a long way in terms of quality of life issues, driving down crashes with serious injury by policing and enforcing certain intersections and locations. But if officers are afraid to stop cars at nighttime for fear that the operator is a person of color and then be labeled a racist police officer because he or she stopped a person of color, now we've got officers in fear to do their job, which results in compromised public safety. It's a great question.
And yes, as we get ready for the next question, I'll just interject one thing, which is something that my daughter passed on to me, a simple quote about these incidents, which is that one definition of white privilege she found was that we can afford to be very, very angry about what happened without being scared. We're going to take question in the third row there.
Hi, thank you so much for this amazing discussion. I hope we can continue this discussion in Arlington. And I really appreciate the historical context, particularly that you have given to this, Professor. And I also appreciate that you brought in our Native American brothers and sisters, whose the genocide of indigenous people is also vitally important for us to understand what we are living with in this historical moment. And I also think it's really important, especially for white folks, to understand when we talk about white supremacy. I think it's time now that terminology start to be used and understood. So if you could speak a little bit to that and just lay it out a little bit more. What do we mean when we talk about white supremacy specifically? Because I think a lot of people think that racism is based on your personal feelings about other. And I think we need at this point to really be clear about what is white supremacy.
Yeah, no, it was a great question. In terms of Native Americans, I mean, last year we commemorated the 150th of the Sandy Creek massacre, which occurred during the Civil War. What the extirpation, the genocide against Native Americans, and the fact that now they're their own sovereign nation, but they're still run by the federal government, Bureau of Indian Affairs. You have to have a blood certificate. And the feds are basically providing you with the context of your own citizenship and nationhood, and the level of poverty that we see in Native American reservations and casinos, and the low level of higher education among Native peoples. This is all part of our social justice struggle, and certainly in the context of the 1960s, at its best, civil rights and the Black Power period joined with Native American activists. Native American activists took over Alcatraz in 1969. There was something that was the self-proclaimed American Indian movement with Russell Means and others who did extraordinary things, not just in the Dakotas, the so-called Badlands, but all around this country, and connected with civil rights activists, connected with Latino activists. So there was a rainbow movement in the United States. Fred Hampton of the Chicago Black Panther Party called it rainbow radicalism. By '84, Jesse Jackson called it the Rainbow Coalition. Martin Luther King called it a beloved community. And one of the interesting things, and I'm going to talk about white supremacy, is that Jesse Jackson, 30 years ago and a half, in San Francisco, gave a speech at the Democratic National Convention, and this was 20 years after Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman were assassinated in Mississippi. 20 years later, gave a speech at the Democratic National Convention. Very, very remarkable speech. Jackson had received 3.5 million votes in the Democratic primaries, but what he did in '84 and '88, he received about 10 million votes altogether. He changed the Democratic primary rules from winner-take-all to proportional representation. Him and Donna Brazile and others. That's how you get Barack Obama. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, they split 36 million votes, 18 and 18, with Hillary getting over 100,000 than Obama nationally. The reason he wins is because of Jesse Jackson's changing of the Democratic primary rules from winner-take-all to proportional representation. And that's what we mean by policy transformations, even internally playing inside baseball. When we talk about white supremacy, what we mean is not just the KKK. We mean not just racial terrorists. We're talking about an ideology. And what ideology is a belief system. It's a set of beliefs. And we're saying that this country has historically been set not just as a racist country. And when we say, okay, what is racism? Racism is institutionalized, and it means institutions are treating different bodies differently, okay? So they treat different bodies based on sometimes race, sometimes ethnicity, sometimes the color of your skin, right? Sometimes religion, right? You talk about Serbia, Bosnia, right? They treat different bodies differently in an institutionalized way. The criminal justice system treats you differently. The police, the schools, it's different. Your treatment is different. Your outcomes are different. And you can't just say, hey, I'm white, please treat me well, right? Because then it's not institutionalized. If the government said, well, if you say you're white, then this is fine with us. It's not like that, right? So that's racism. But what white supremacy is, it's an ideology, and it's coming out of, when we say where is it coming out of, we're talking about Great Britain, the whole idea of empire. The British are racist against the Scottish. They are racist against the Irish. They are racist against other people who are not British. It's a kind of nationalism. What we have in terms of white supremacy in the 20th century is that everyone is included in that paradigm of white. At times, even Jews. Jews had been the last line with the huge anti-Semitism that this country has had and still perpetuates in certain instances. Now, this ideology of white supremacy, its politics and practices mean that even poor whites gain a kind of advantage, not just psychologically, but public policy-wise. So poor whites are not mistreated by criminal justice system in the same manner as poor blacks. So when we think about this politics of white supremacy, it means that sociologists have done studies where a black man with a college degree has about as good of a chance of getting a job as a white man with a high school degree who's a convicted felon, right? That's problematic, and they've done those studies at Princeton. That's hugely, hugely problematic. So when we think about white supremacy, white privilege is just a subsidiary of white supremacy, right? And again, it might make, when you talk to white people about privilege, it makes them feel uncomfortable. When you talk to black men about male privilege, it makes them feel uncomfortable, right? Doesn't mean you don't do it, because black men do have a male privilege in this society. Black straight men have a heterosexual privilege, and you talk to them about that. They might feel uncomfortable and say, I'm black, I've been marginalized. Yeah, but you also have this privilege, right? We can also at times bond with other males over football or over maybe denigrating somebody, right? We can bond that way. So when we think about this system of white supremacy, we have to talk about it. You know, it's not some liberal scheme. It's connected to slavery, and it's connected to the way we live now. The interesting part, though, is that we've tried to, historically, there's been social justice movements, including whites being a part of this, that have tried to abolish white supremacy, and that's the more interesting part. The interesting part is that we are still struggling for this dream of racial and economic justice in the United States and gender justice and LGBT equality. That's what we're struggling for, right? And so the hope for all of us is that we're leaving our children and our grandchildren with a better country and a better society and a better world than we've left it with. But we can't, than we inherited, but what we can't do is not talk about it. The worst part is the silence.
Right, and I think just to follow up a little bit on what Dr. Joseph was saying is that, this institutional racism and the fact that on paper, it's all equal, but in practice it isn't. So for example, the GI Bill is the best example of affirmative action for white males.
Yeah.
It changed everything. The whole fact that they were able to go to college, those kind of things. I mean, the black soldiers coming back were supposed to be able to get all those benefits too,
No.
but they never did. They were never told that they could go and get these employment opportunities or go to college or buy houses or anything. So there's the post-war benefits were extremely different. And that's the same thing that's now happening with all, for example, the Fourth Amendment. Basically with consent searches, you are not supposed to be able to just go ahead and tell somebody, a police officer can't just say, can I look at what's in your backpack? You're supposed to be able to have the right to say no. Mm-hmm. But poor people are never told that. No. The police do not have to tell them that you can refuse. Yeah. And then when you refuse, then it becomes, they're acting suspiciously. Mm-hmm. So now there's reason. So how do you win?
Well, I'm afraid that we are down to our last question. So
And
you are the lucky man to give it.
So
I know, I
I sort of have a
apologize, I
two-part
lied.
question, and this goes to Ferguson, and maybe the first part to Professor, and which is, are you aware? First question: are you aware what percentage of eligible African American voters in Ferguson are registered to vote and actually voted? Mm-hmm. And then the second part that is, if 100% of eligible African American voters did vote, what kind of difference would it have made? Sort of in Ferguson in general, and that's to all three of you. The first one might be more empirical, that only the professor would know. And then I guess maybe if you don't think it would have made much difference, I might hesitate to ask this, but why not? I mean, that's democracy at a core. So first, what percentage? If we had 100%, what kind of difference? How would it have made?
Well, in terms of percentage, it's low. I know in terms of Ferguson, 21,000 people, 67% African American, 22% of the African American population lives below the poverty line. People who voted in the last mayoral election, it was very, very low. It was very, very low. Maybe only about 5,000 people voted, just period. It was a very low voter turnout. I think the biggest problem with voting in Ferguson is that what you see when you do the demographics and you do the empirical stuff across the country, the reason why the AARP is so important is because they vote, okay? Retired folks vote, white retirees vote, whites over 50 and who have incomes of over 100,000 vote at an extraordinary rate, even in midterm elections, sometimes at a 70% clip, which is why people are very, very interested in that vote. One thing we have to do, though, when we think about poor black folks, both in Ferguson and across the board, the reason why the vote is so low is because they don't feel empowered. When you think about citizenship, and I'm somebody who studied citizenship and democracy my whole life, and how do we get people to vote? How do we get people to be, not just vote, but to be part of PTA meetings and meetings like this? One of the things about this idea of white privilege and also economic privilege is that you feel empowered. So the vote is really the tip of the spear. It's the last thing you do when you feel like you're a citizen. It's very, very easy to do. You drop the kids off, you do all these different things. The interesting part about people who are poor, and when you look at voting, when you go to things like voting and the number of people who are on welfare who vote, the number of people who are unemployed who vote becomes very, very low. That's why 20 years ago when they tried to do the motor voter registration bill, which did get passed, initially it wasn't supposed to be just registering to vote at DMVs. It was supposed to be registering to vote, including at welfare and unemployment offices, and they stopped that, right? So we also live in a country that doesn't want everybody to vote.
One second, because I think it's important why people don't vote. But really, a more important question I'd like to all three of you, if you had 100% of the African American community in Ferguson voted, would it have made a difference? What kind of difference would it have made? And it's an open question, but in general, and if you don't think it, well, I'll leave it at that. Would it have made a difference, and what kind of difference if 100%, if you could get at that kind of voting?
Well, if we're assuming the district attorney was flawed in his presentation of the grand jury evidence, I think it could have had a huge impact. Had that if that's the case, I'm not agreeing that is. I happen to think police officers have the same constitutional rights as non-police officers, and this grand jury rendered its decision. Now, is our judicial system perfect? Absolutely not. We have police officers that go to court every day with strong evidence on people that go unconvicted, and people aren't marching in the streets over those cases. And in this instance, police officers, or the Ferguson case, the police officer was not indicted. But I think my point is if we're assuming that the presentation of evidence was flawed, and it was presented by an elected district attorney, clearly there could have been an impact had there been voting.
Yeah, and I say no. There would have been a major impact. I mean, one of the things, New York Times had a front page story on Ferguson and how, you know, they've issued more warrants than the population, and how so many young black men are caught up in those warrants. I mean, I think it's one, if the population had voted, but also who they voted for and on what platform, and that they're elected officials, they held them accountable. We're going to assume that if you have an active citizenry, that 22% of them are poor. They're going to want social services. They're going to want better treatment by the police. They're going to want a more diverse police force, 55 police officers, 2 of which are African American, in a place that's 67% African American. You know, a city
So it is
council-
important to diversify the police department.
No, it is. It is important. I didn't say it wasn't. I just said, just like you said about the cameras, that it wasn't a magic bullet. Sometimes
Gotcha.
people
Okay.
feel that, you know, if we could just have the most diverse police force in the world, that would stop.
Right, I got you.
A black police officer could commit police brutality too. You know, part of it is, like we said, it's like, what are the mandates they're getting from politicians, but also just the society? Like, what are we saying our police officers can get away with, right? When we send messages to our police officers, our doctors, our nurses, our teachers, right? We send those messages all the time. So no, I think it would have been hugely transformative. I think it would have been transformative having political power in Ferguson, because part of what you saw in Ferguson was an abject lack of political power that was reminiscent of the 1960s before Selma, in the sense that before the Voting Rights Act, you did have these majority-minority communities in the South where there was white power because African Americans were prevented from voting, including in Selma. Not Selma per se, but certain counties in Alabama, the so-called Black Belt. Lowndes County is a great example of this. So I think it would have made a big difference.
I just have to just make a last comment, which is, it's interesting that nobody raised it up till now, this whole voting thing, and it's just clear to me that has to be a huge focus of this discussion. I don't
people
care.
have raised
let
it
me
in
just finish,
Ferguson.
let me just finish this, because I don't care poor. People have to vote if they're not happy with things are. And that's why I was wondering if you said, no, it wouldn't have mattered, then we got a bigger problem.
But would that stop the police officer from shooting?
Let's ask. The answer up here seems to be a little bit.
No, I think it would have transformed the outcome and maybe even transformed community police relations if there had been at least some kind of power sharing, because you could have black voters who trust white candidates, right? Because when you think about the African American community who've been allowed, who've earned the right to vote through harsh struggle, Barack Obama is the first black president that they ever had a chance to vote for. Most of the time, you're in a position where you're voting for president, you're voting for senator, voting, like Duval Patrick's the first black governor here, right? Ed Brooke was one black senator from 66 to 78. So most of the time, we, as African Americans, we entrust our political futures to white candidates. That's why it's much, you know, by the time white people feel like, oh, they deserve a pat on the back for Obama, historically, we've been that was always the position we were in, where you're trusting, you know, some white candidate, usually male, because we didn't live in a world with Hillary Clinton. When we think about this historically, who's saying the right things, who's saying, hey, I trust, I believe in your cause, or I'm compassionate to this constituency. So I think that it depends. You could even have white politicians in Ferguson who are very, very compassionate and in tune with the needs of the African American community. You know, so part of it is we need to vote, but I also think we have to understand why people don't vote and why we need more than just the vote. The vote is the last thing that you check off in your citizenship card. Like attending some of meetings like this, right, is part of it. Going and attending meetings connected to diversity, to youth, to immigration, to seniors. All these things are a part of it. And then once you're that empowered, of course you vote. I've had students at Tufts who are so excited to vote, you would think that they won the lottery.
Okay.
Right? Because they've been inculcated and felt empowered to vote.
Just quickly, to that gentleman's point. And in Massachusetts, you know, we have to agree, training police officers is important. And I talked about training police officers about their own biases, about the blink response. and some training that may have prevented what occurred in Ferguson. There are only 4 other states that spend fewer dollars per capita on police training than Massachusetts. Our police training is bottom in the country. So again, when I say lawmakers, you know, there's a lot of anger towards police, and I get it. I don't see anybody screaming at lawmakers. And I think we're missing the point in a lot of critical areas around preventing what occurred in Ferguson.
Which goes, of course, right to the point that the last questioner was making about the importance of voting, and that you
Right.
guys were as well. So with that, we're at a tidy 2 hours here. We are just wrapping up this part of a conversation. We anticipate and hope that this is just the first part of an ongoing conversation here in the ACMi studios and out there on the streets of Arlington and beyond about these very knotty, very compelling, very important issues for, in fact, all of us. So I want to take this last opportunity to thank our distinguished panelists, Chief Frederick Ryan, Ms. Bonnie Bagchi Williamson, and Professor Peniel Joseph, for being here, and for everybody in our studio audience who stuck in throughout the whole thing. And for those of you who didn't get to ask your questions, we apologize. We will continue this conversation. Thanks for joining us. For Arlington Public News and Arlington Community Media, this is James Milan. Thanks a lot.
This is great.